Look, there's a lot of disagreement often in areas of Indigenous affairs, but there's one thing around Indigenous affairs you think all Australians normally can agree on, and that is closing the gap, getting rid of Indigenous disadvantage, making sure Indigenous people have the same job opportunities, life expectancy and the rest of it that the rest of the country does. So the latest Closing the Gap agreement is a big step forward. It's a new deal, but there are some things about it that are very different from what's gone before. So let's find out from Jacinta Price exactly what's changed and what's missing. Thanks for joining us, Jacinta. The first change here is that a lot of the arrangements are with Indigenous groups, that rather than governments delivering better education or health services or employment services, they're outsourcing to a range of Indigenous groups. Is that a way to express it?
Well, it certainly looks like it. It's been driven by 50 peak Aboriginal organisations, and, they're claiming that this will, ensure that decisions are made at a grassroots level and not from ivory towers. But I beg to see the difference in them both. And the way I see it, it's just that they've got greater control over funding. If there's any accountability, we'll wait and see if that comes about, because there certainly hasn't been in the past. And many of these organisations have already had 13 years of closing the gap to try and close the gap. So, yeah, I'm baffled.
Yeah, well, the bad news is that because of the Closing the Gap targets and the reports, we can see exactly what's happening, and there's just been too little achieved when it comes to improving living standards, improving educational outcomes, improving employment, and all those markers, health markers. And one that you've focused on is domestic violence, and there was going to be a target that was scrapped from this, looking to reduce the number of victims of domestic violence. I would have thought this would be front and centre for Indigenous communities.
Well, most definitely, considering that there's a target to reduce rates of incarceration by 15%, you would think that a target to reduce family violence and crime would actually work hand in hand. Aside from that, there's a target to reduce children in out-of-home care by 45%, and yet there's no target to reduce child abuse, to reduce neglect and sexual abuse and those sorts of things. You would think that those targets would lend themselves to reducing the number of children in out-of-home care. There's no target to deal with alcohol or substance abuse. And a lot of these targets, I feel, again, the terminology, the jargon around them aren't necessarily going to be understood by people at grassroots levels either. It's all bureaucratically run as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and Warren Mundine makes the point. He does a lot of work in job creation in Indigenous communities, and he's saying there's not enough there private enterprise expertise involved in trying to create the jobs. In fact, he and you and Noel Pearson and Megan Davis, there's a lot of significant Aboriginal leaders in this country who are critical about the outcome here.
Most definitely. And look, myself and Warren and a few other panellists have been having webinars recently talking about, pathways through economic independence for Indigenous Australians. And that's another thing that is not that's not mentioned at all, is around economic sovereignty for Indigenous Australians, providing pathways out of welfare through things like private enterprise, through things like, small business and those sorts of things. That they don't exist. But what we've heard from the co-chair, Pat Turner, is that she claims that by funding these Aboriginal organisations, they're going to tackle welfare by employing Indigenous Australians through these organisations. What if you don't want to work for an Aboriginal organisation? And again, it's changing the welfare from the individual to the bureaucracy instead. And we've got to pay these people, obviously. Who's going to pay for it? The government's going to pay for it. The taxpayer's going to pay for it. We want economic independence as well for Indigenous Australians.
And let's just come back to domestic violence and incarceration. Do you have the numbers, the percentages of Indigenous people who are in jail because of domestic violence? The point being, of course, as you say, if you can really cut down on domestic violence, therefore protect Aboriginal women and children primarily, not only do you protect them, but obviously you fulfil that secondary aim of keeping Indigenous men out of jail.
Exactly. So, we're looking at 2/3 of Aboriginal people are incarcerated for acts intended to cause harm, for sexual assault crimes, for violent crimes. So it just makes sense that if we find ways to reduce crime, particularly in those areas, not only are we going to reduce levels of incarceration, but we are going to create safer homes for children and for families as well. We're going to create environments for more functional human beings who can participate in wider society and as part of, take advantage of the riches of the Australian economy that the Australian economy has to provide. It all goes hand in hand, and yet I see these targets as steps backward from the sorts of work that we saw, Howard and previous governments in the past do towards Indigenous advancement.
Spot on. Thanks for sharing those strong opinions with us, Jacinta. Have a good weekend.